Okay, welcome back. It's a great honor to have three academics from all over the world, from United States, Vienna, Great Britain, with us. And it's a special honor also to have Ed Freeman here. Why? Because it's in the middle of the night in the United States. And when we prepared this meeting, I asked whether he had a good alarm clock. And he had obviously a good alarm clock. And he is now in the middle of the night live with us, Ed Freeman. As you probably know, he just started a stakeholder podcast. He is one of the inventors of stakeholder theory. He also plays in two bands, and he is also a handball player. But as I learned in the United States, handball means something different than in Europe. But what is most important, he will just now give us his main ideas about what responsible leadership could mean and what will be the new narrative when we talk about leadership and business and society. And yeah, I just want to give the floor now to Ed Freeman to give his 5 minutes input on this. Hi, Ed.
Hi, thanks, Renee. I'll do my best not to fall asleep. I just had a triple espresso, so I should be okay. There have been lots of calls for reform of business and business leadership, essentially since the Great Recession. And these reforms have gone all over the place. Conscious capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, impact investing, there are 30 or 40 of them. I was at a meeting at the White House in the waning days of the Obama administration, and it was all the people that had started these movements for reform. And everybody was talking about what's the right brand, how are we going to think about business leadership and business. And I sat there and thinking, well, maybe this is not the best question to be asking. Maybe a better question is, what are the 4 or 5 key ideas that whatever the revised version of business leadership looks like, it has to deal with these 4 or 5 key ideas. And so 2 colleagues, Bobby Parmar and Kirsten Martin, and I wrote a book, which is just out, called The Power of And, responsible leadership without trade-offs, a responsible business without trade-offs. And what we said was there are 5 ideas, and I'll just quickly list them. That this new narrative of business has to deal with purpose and profits, not one or the other. It has to deal with both. It has to deal with stakeholders and shareholders. I've always thought that was a false choice. It has to deal with society, business as a societal institution, and business as a market institution. Again, both of them. It has to deal with our humanity as human beings, and the fact that we're economic beings. It has to deal with both of those things, and it has to deal with ethics and business. And we have to see these 5 things not as things we make trade-offs are. Oh, we can be a little bit more ethical, but it'll cost us profits. But we have to think through. We have to think through how to encompass each of these things without trading them off with each other. So responsible leadership is thinking about how we exercise the creative imagination so that we can stop the trade-off thinking that really has been, I think, a cornerstone of the shareholder-only era. I think that era is over. There's no going back to that. And if we can figure out how we can adopt these 5 ideas, and maybe there are more, these are just the 5 we focused on, we can build an idea of business leadership and of business that makes sense in today's world. The good news in all this is there are hundreds of businesses out doing this. And this is the call for business school professors like us, is we need to think about the businesses that are doing this, not necessarily just the ones who have problems. So let me stop there. I think that's 4 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really like this idea about having a new mindset, and maybe this new mindset is really emerging also out of the crisis, that we don't see business and society long as a kind of a trade-off or a opposite. It's really going hand in hand, and we see it. You cannot have a healthy economy with a healthy society, and vice versa. And another very prominent colleague of us is Oliver Laasch from Manchester Business School. He also is doing a lot of research on leadership issues. And I would particularly interested in how you see the whole thing. You are originally from Frankfurt. So in the beginning, when we set up the conference, you were very happy to come back here to Frankfurt. Now you're here virtually, but next time for sure, I hope you can also come home to your home city. You also teach responsible business practices. When you were a young person in the insurance industry, you saw also a lot of irresponsible practices, and then you said, okay, I really would like to go to teach responsible management. And so I think you are very qualified now, also because you just published a research handbook on responsible management, which will also come out soon. I think we'll see a lot of books coming. With Ed together, so there's also this international collaboration, which is good. So maybe you can just give also some short remarks on what Ed said from your perspective.
Sure. So I have a brief presentation, and I promised already it's not going to be longer than 4.5 minutes. But could we show that? Oh, there it comes. Excellent.
Yeah, the presentation is coming. Perfect.
So maybe while we wait for it to go on full screen, I actually disagree partly with what Ed said about the trade-offs, but I think we could come to that point a little bit later when we're in the discussion. Could we put it on full screen, please?
I hope the technicians have this. Possible.
Something is happening.
Yes. So in the meantime, I think it's quite amazing now with the new technology that we can connect globally this way, which is great. So yeah. I see the presentation.
Okay, I could maybe start if that's okay. Yeah. So my somewhat probably unrealistic purpose is to hopefully incite some subversively responsible management practices among you. So let's see how that really goes. I believe many of us have the feeling that we're living in a very turmoil characterized times. We're of course living through COVID. We feel the first outliers of impacts of global warming. There's a looming biodiversity collapse, and so it's really easy to get into a gloom and doom mode. But at the same time, it seems like there's very, very big moves towards rethinking the way how we should manage, how we should lead on the way as well. But if we're honest, to what degree is that actually something that we are doing in our daily jobs when we are working ourselves? So my first point here is that I actually believe that while we should be rocking the boat, what we are really doing is that we are very, very busy just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I don't think it's radical or drastic enough what everybody is doing on a day-to-day basis. And you might find it somewhat surprising that I actually think the things we should be doing should be to focus on practices, because practices are boring, right? We're doing them on a daily basis. We don't even think about them. But think about something like factory production. Think about how without factory production, we wouldn't live that kind of middle-class, comfortable lives we're living today. We wouldn't have the convenient wages. We wouldn't have the affordable products. But at the same time, we also wouldn't have most of the environmental problems that threaten to wipe us off the planet. We wouldn't have global income inequality in the way that we have it right now. Or if you want to think about a more recent example, think about the practices of subprime lending. A long time unquestioned, then boom, there's a crisis that just turns the social and economic fabric of the world upside down for over a decade. So we have to mind the management practices that make and then potentially can break our world, even if they're often not something we actively think about. But also there's very positively disruptive management practices. And Ed said there's hundreds of business out there, I agree. And I just have 4 quick examples. So think about a practice like open hiring of Grayston Bakery in Yonkers, close to New York. So open hiring contradicts our traditional and rather well-established strategic hiring paradigm. Get the best people, screen them, scan them, and out of 100, pick the one who is going to be the most valuable one. No, they hire anybody who walks through the door, and don't look at any CVs or any background checks. Or think about the company Yash Pakka in India, who are doing a radical version of employee self-management in an Indian society that is characterized by the caste system, by hierarchies, breaking down all of the hierarchies. Or think about the company Good Art in Suzhou in China, who center their business model and much of their daily activities on humanistic education for their employees. Think about how that contradicts, if you pay that level of attention to the spiritual and human well-being of your people, how that contradicts what we take for granted as human resources for production. Or think about an example much closer to home, like Allsafe down there in southern Germany, close to Lake Constance, a automobile and aerospace manufacturing company. Think about how their eye-level management, meaning that they give their employees freedom and hope that they act with responsibility, possibly making mistakes, not controlling them, how that contradicts the dominant paradigm in an industry like this, where everything is about Six Sigma, not making mistakes, not deviating from the norm. So my last point here is really that if we want to have real change, what we have to do on a daily basis is to aspire and to enact to make that kind of subversive, contradictory practice that often feel unrealistic a reality. So it would be great to be in touch. Please feel free to reach out to me with any points and ideas about that presentation, possibly even share your own unrealistic practices if you have any examples. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for giving these practice examples, even if they look unrealistic, and I think it very much fits in line what Ed Freeman says, but you also said that you have some contradictory thoughts on this. We will learn about this later, but now I also would like to give the word to Christof Miska from Vienna, from the Wirtschaftsuniversität Wien. He has co-founded a leadership lab there at the university, and he's also researching differences in across cultures. Yeah, so we also saw already some different cultures from India, Germany, and different parts of the world. So it would be really nice also to learn a little bit more from these different cultures and your research on it. You also published a couple of books, and so I think you are very much the right person to give now a final remark before we start our discussion. Hi, Christof.
Well, thank you very much. That's a tough remark after what we've heard from Ed and Oliver. Thanks for having me in this panel. It's an honor. And I think what I have to say is rather complementary to what Ed and Oliver said. Let me say that in responsible leadership research, we don't really have a clear definition or idea what responsible leadership is. So very much like in practice, we don't quite agree and there's different thoughts. But I think what the current crisis shows quite impressively is the relevance and the importance of values and virtues. So I believe crises are always a good opportunity to rethink our purpose, to rethink our values, to ask the question, what do I stand for in these rough times? And this goes back to some of the very early responsible leadership research in the early 2000s by Thomas Mark and Nicolas Plast, who had this notion of responsible leaders are embedded in a global stakeholder society where they're responsible not just for immediate followers like employees or shareholders, but society as a whole, the environment as a whole. And obviously, if you're dealing with so many different stakeholders, many of which you can't really control directly, what you need is a strong moral compass, strong moral values as a foundation. So I think this is an important starting point. My second point is, I don't believe that values and virtues alone will be enough. So when we develop responsible leaders, we need to develop the corresponding skill sets and competencies. So things like leading people immediately or showing vision might be an important foundation, but I think what we will need in the future is more of perspective-taking abilities, ethical literacy, boundary spanning abilities, so things that cannot be trained easily. And this is why here in the Leadership Lab, we also put a strong focus on out-of-the-box ideas in developing responsible leaders. And I'm looking at the crisis from a leadership development point of view is something that puts all of us out of our comfort zones. So we all have an opportunity to learn how we're dealing in this very unreal time. And my third point is a more general basis. I think that the notion of leadership and particularly responsible leadership in the future needs to have more of what we call a contemporary sense in research. So not just focus on immediate followers within organizations, but really looking at this broad stakeholder web, where we need also different thinking styles. And contemporary leadership expresses that very much by, for example, not making a either or decision, but trying to achieve both, by not considering hierarchies, but by looking at systems and seeing ourselves as embedded in entire systems. And one of the reasons why I believe this is so important is we see a lot of strongman leadership or populist leadership in the current times, particularly in politics, but of course also in business. And we have this natural tendency, when times are rough, we want a strong man. We don't want a strong woman. Although, as we see, in particular when we look at political leaders, some of the women are doing a way better job than men. So I think in research, but also in practice, we need to point to this aspect of contemporary leadership, opposing populist leadership, opposing the big shouters that are not able to do anything, to achieve anything, but those who really have these skill sets and competencies and corresponding values in place.
Okay, thank you very much. I think very good thoughts. Ed, if you now hear this from our European colleagues, and as you know, in Europe, we had to reinvent ourselves already after the Second World War. In Germany, we developed the social market economy. So we are quite used in Europe to somehow overcome the trade-off. But now it's particularly interesting why this idea now is getting stronger also in the United States. Is this something related to politics? And the second question is, how in practice can you really overcome this trade-off? Yeah, because I really like this new mindset, but it seems sometimes, especially in politics, but also in some big companies, it's not so easy to overcome the trade-off. What would be your advice?
Well, politics, I don't know. I try not to think about that as an American these days. But you know, if all you look for is trade-offs, that's all you're going to find. If you look for trade-offs, you might not find them, so you might have to make them. But if you don't look for them, I'm pretty sure you're not going to find them. And I've had a number of CEO friends who have said, look, once you start doing this, you get better at it. You know, you think to yourself, not how can I trade this off with each other? How can I make this trade-off decision? But gee, what can I do to make customers better off that also makes the community better off? What can I do that makes suppliers better partners for me and makes me earn more money for shareholders? And it's that granular level of trade-offs that you know, it wins. There's no question about that in my mind. It wins in the marketplace. I have a number of friends who are in conscious capitalism who say, look, this is just table stakes. This is the way you have to think about it now.
Okay.
There's always crony capitalism. There's always crony capitalism, trying to get the rules oriented, you know, so that you have the favored thing. I wish I knew how to what to do about that, but I don't.
Yeah, it sounds very logical to just change the Googles you have, how you see the world, and if you look for trade-offs, you find them. But if you look for the positive sum game, if you look for the synergy, for the good power of and, as you call it, you see it. And Oliver, sounds very simple, the concept.
Yes.
Is it that simple, or do we really need to radical change as you were introducing your ideas?
Well, I admit I started out in the system from a strategic CSR perspective, looking actively for the business case, suggesting we can solve any problem by finding that win-win, avoiding the trade-off. Although listening to Ed, I understand the idea of win-win is a different one from the type of avoiding trade-off you're presenting right now. But
yeah, I'm not talking about CSR and business
right,
case.
shared value and so on, right. But I think I think the language of avoiding trade-off lends itself to being misunderstood as saying, well, we always have to do the thing that somehow pays, or we always have to do the thing that's good for us as a business. Where I think in the kind of drastic changes that we're looking for right now, at least in the medium run, there have to be losses if you use the traditional narrative. There have to be issues where you just say, okay, that's the right thing to do, and it's gonna hurt, but we have to do it right now. We have to do it quickly. And Ed
Well,
wants to come back in there. I understand. Yeah.
let me just be clear. What's the business? The business is your purpose. The business is your stakeholders, how you create value for them. So when Medtronic, a pacemaker, says, as they did recently, we're going to give away the plans that we have for making ventilators. We're going to have our engineers help people use those patents to make ventilators. This is not a time to think about profits.
Right.
They haven't given up thinking about profits. They just understand in a way that lots of people don't, especially academics.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you, because you do understand this, that profits are an outcome. You know, how you create value for stakeholders determines profits. They're not the only outcome, but they are one, and you do have to think about that.
I see. It's more kind of an integrated perspective, and it's more than just win-win. I think that's very important that we also see this. Win-win is the old logic. The new one is really to find the purpose and the power of and overcoming the trade-off, and really get committed not only to money but really to kind of a company purpose. Christof, if you hear all this, where does the value issues come in? Yeah, so because if I can rationally argue that the best is to follow the purpose, make impact, and that's basically the new mindset managers should have, where is the ethics, or is there still ethics necessary, or which kind of values we are talking do managers need in order to get this new mindset into practice?
I'd say I partially agree and partially disagree with what has been said, because the way I like looking at trade-offs is they're there, and it doesn't matter if we look at purpose, if we look at systems, be it capitalist systems or more social market systems or communist-like systems. There's always going to be trade-offs because of a lack of resources, a lack of time, a lack of perspective. So I think we need to embrace trade-offs. It doesn't matter if we look for them or not, they're always there, and we need to embrace them. And this is where the values come in. If I'm aware of my values, I know what the consequences are of 2 or 3 or 4 different alternatives. If I'm aware of that, I'm better able to take a decision and live with that decision. And when the next trade-off comes, and it will come, doesn't matter if I like or not, then I know what my grounds are, and it will be easier to take that decision. But what I think, and this hasn't been mentioned in the discussion so far, is long-term thinking. Oliver, to some extent, and this is what our research also shows, trade-offs are mostly trade-offs because we tend to look at them with a short-term perspective. But if we adopt a longer-term perspective, and this is where it might hurt at the moment, but in the future it might pay off, then we get a very different perspectives on those trade-offs. But of course, without a clear value base, I would know which direction to go. So it's your orientation, it's your compass.
Well, look, of course, Christof's right. You have to understand your values and what's there, but sometimes values conflict, and you don't have to pick one or the other. You have to figure out. You have to be creative. The problem with accepting trade-offs is it says, look, we're stuck with what's there. I think one of the beautiful things about capitalism and business is you engage the creative imagination. You engage the creative imagination to do things that look like they're contradictory. Every great business has managed to figure that out. And what we don't teach, I think you're absolutely right about this. What we don't teach is how to engage the creative imagination. How many executives who want to do leadership training are willing to engage the humanities or the creative arts? That's where you teach creative imagination. That's where you get people to think differently and outside the box. you know, and I think that's a really important issue for business schools to deal with if they're not going to just become irrelevant.
Yeah.
That's
May I
two questions.
share just
Oh, yeah.
one very, very brief direct reply and reinforcing what Ed just said. Just recently, I wrote the second edition of a textbook on responsible management. And while looking at the other textbooks out there, what I noticed was that among 20 introduction to management textbooks I looked at, how many do you think had an innovation or creativity chapter? Zero. So imagine that. So how can we kind of navigate around the trade-offs if we're not teaching our, as Ed just said, our students to be creative and innovative managers?
Well, it also might be, Oliver. I know when I did the third edition of Stoner's Principles of Management, we put art in every chapter. We talked about the creative imagination, but we put it in every chapter. I'm not sure that the technique-oriented creativity is the way to do that. I know improvisational jazz teaches you to be creative. I know being in the theater teaches you to be creative. I know that dealing with great text and literature teaches you to be creative. There aren't many of those courses in.
So there's content and method. We need both.
And it has to be both. It has to be both of those things.
Ed, Christof introduced the concept also long-term, short-term, and he said there's a trade-off there. You have not mentioned it in your principles so far. How do we overcome this kind of trade-offs between long and short-term thinking? How is it to integrate time, so to say? There is really just one perspective of time, and that we don't consider long and short-term and weight it somehow.
I've heard for 40 years, I've been doing this a long time, I've heard for 40 years, Ed, the stakeholders ethics stuff makes sense, but it makes sense in the long term, not the short term. And by the way, as the short term continues, the long term gets further away, right? And so what people are trying to say when they say that is, we don't think this works. As I've gotten older, I've got to confess, I have a deep distrust of the long term. You know, look, what do you want to be in 10 years? You know, my answer, especially with COVID, is breathing. You know, I'd like to be above ground breathing. I think short term, long term can be an excuse not to do the creative work, to do the right thing now. Life is lived in the short term. If at some point we can't figure out how to create value, let's just pick an example, how to create value for our stakeholders or do the ethical thing. We can't figure out how to do that now in the short term. Then saying it pays in the long term is just, you know, I'll be a rude American for a minute who's in the middle of the night. It's just bullshit. And so I think we have to face up to, we need to say, no, this is what we need to do now. We need to think about this in a different way now. And then the long term emerges. The way to have a great long term, have a great short term and keep it up. But it's got to start with doing the right thing now, not saying, oh, you know, in the long term, that'll work out. As Keen said, in the long term, we're all dead. Some of us, for some of us, that's
Oliver, Christof, what should we do now? We are in the midst of a crisis. The COVID crisis is changing everything. We saw a lot of creativity also within business. We are now here having the conference digitally. So I think we are somehow in a state where we have a lot of energy, a lot of power. So what is the right thing now as a leader to do from your research?
Christof,
is it the right time and moment now?
So I think there's a lot that already happened before the crisis, when CEOs like Paul Pullman, former CEO of Unilever, abolished quarterly reporting, which brought a lot of criticism from shareholders. But the intention there was, of course, to induce this longer term perspective. If we just live for 3 months, 6 months, naturally we're inducing this short term perspective. And I think there's a lot that companies can do when it comes to bonus payments, when it comes to employee evaluations and performance measurements. So it is not just with a half a year or year perspective, but with a longer term perspective in mind, to have not just the short-term goal, but also a long-term goal. So practically, I think there's a lot that can be done. And it's perhaps not so much about specific initiatives, but more also about, again, mindsets. And I think there's a lot we can learn from Asian cultures, as you were touching upon before, cross-cultural issues. In the Western world, we naturally have the short-term perspective, but if we look at Japan, for example, and this traditional notion of long-term orientation, which is much longer than just 10 years, there's a lot we can take away from these areas of the globe.
I've got two very short points on that. One thing is that well, it looks like we were forced to stop in a way, which is great for thinking most of the times if you don't get too afraid. So I think we're in a position now where many of the things are disrupted already. So it's much easier to start in a different way, and that partly connects to what Christof is saying. And in a recent exchange I had with Muhammad Yunus, the inventor of microfinance, one of the greatest innovations in management practices of all times, I think. He said, well, we just shouldn't let them in again. So everybody who's practicing management and business the wrong way, leave them out. Don't let them start again. Let the machine sleep. Let them die. So a very radical perspective, if you want so, but I think we can learn a lot from that. And the second example, very practical example of how that could be done, actually comes from one of the companies I mentioned before, Allsafe, who during the economic crisis about 10 years ago, actually kept all of their staff. They kept paying them full time, and they invested all of that time in order to reinvent how they ran their practice. So they were ready, as Christof said before. A lot was going on before, but because business was good, there was never the time to really go deep and to rethink how should we do things differently. And I think that time is now. It's the perfect opportunity to do that rethinking and restarting.
Yeah, if you want to know the extent of what business is doing, there's a website done by a group called Just Capital. Just Capital rates companies with their ethics. And given that the Business Roundtable in the U.S. put out this statement about the importance of stakeholder capitalism, Just Capital is holding their feet to the fire. So they've actually have this website where all the 180 or so companies that signed the stakeholder declaration, Just Capital is keeping track of what they're doing with respect to creating value for their stakeholders. And some of them are doing some pretty amazing things. Again, not everybody's perfect. That's not the world we live in. But I don't think there's, as others have said, I don't think there's any going back here. Going back is gonna be except for the crony capitalism, and that is usually when business and government gang up on others.
Especially in times of crisis, some people say leaders need to make tough decisions. Yeah. So do we need tough decisions, or is it kind of a soft transformation you see? Yeah. Because of course there are some people who really are now also radically go for a new economic system. They really want to change everything. And there's others who say, no, we need to somehow change the system within with a new mindset. There's no need for tough decisions. It's more to get the people convinced about that we can have a better world, not sacrificing anything, but really to just set up business in a different perspective and have profit and sustainability at the same time. So what is your opinion? What kind of decisions need to be made?
I think it's a combination of both, because you need to get people on board. So I do agree, it's time for radical changes, and we have this momentum. If they're too radical, you might be losing people, people with different agendas, people with different mindsets, people with fear and anxiety. But I think what's even more important than being radical while also being soft in terms of transition is to be consistent. And I see a big danger that once economies are recovering, we're falling back into old patterns despite this momentum, because we're human beings. And we have this tendency of going back to normal, which in many instances is absolutely justified. But I think when it comes to this transition, we need to be careful not to take a step back once we feel things are getting better.
Elkington just yesterday introduced the concept of the green swan. He said in the mid of a crisis, radical new solutions will pop up. And he is also talking that we need innovation by a factor 10, so really radically new innovation in the field of energy, education, everywhere. Oliver, you also said we need this kind of getting out of the comfort zone, making kind of new decisions which feel strange, awkward, really do things differently. How does this fit to this need of people to be safe, secure, staying in the comfort zone? How can you convince people for this new leadership style?
If I can be controversial here again, I think we're in the very positive position in a way that people are already extremely shaken up. So I think in that type of time that we're living in right now, I think there's much more open, and people know changes will come. Everybody knows everybody talks about the new normal. We know the old normal is never going to come back. It will be different. So I think we are once again in a very, very narrow window of opportunity where those changes can happen. So I think we have to sneak in there, and we just, as Ed said, we just have to start doing it. It starts with the everyday practices. It starts with what you do right after you leave that conference, and you have to keep doing it every day.
Okay, so maybe if you have a magic wand, if you could just make a wish today, what all three of you would wish for? What would you think needs to make it the progress faster? Because I'm also a very impatient person sometimes, so I want to see this progress and transformation going faster. What would be the leverages where we can really also as leaders change something to make it easier to process? Biggest leverage.
We need to become, I'll just speak for the US, we need to become a society of entrepreneurs. We need much more innovation, but we need to make it easy to start businesses. We need to make it easy for people who've been shut out of that process to start businesses, to realize their ideas. What makes business great is there's no one solution. There's no one magical thing. And if we look for magical things, which academics love to do, we're going to screw it up. And so it's the let's let thousands and thousands and thousands of flowers bloom, create an entrepreneurial society. Some of that stuff's not going to work, obviously, but some of it will. And so we need to think about the question at a policy level. How do we create a society of entrepreneurs? We probably need to rethink what we teach in schools for young children. We probably need to think about how accelerators and those kinds of things can work to help people. And we probably need to think about things like in the same way that Yunus thought about microfinance. He turned a bunch of Bangladeshi women into capitalists. And we need to see that in the right way. It's not just about the money. It's about how we create value for each other. And that's the most important principle, it seems to me.
Very good.
Christof, I think we have to stop talking. Well, if you want to, Christof, go first.
I would hope for this shift in mindset and skill sets on the part of business leaders. And that in itself is not magical, because we see when we do leadership development, a lot is possible when people are willing to engage in self-development and personal development. But the magic here, I think, it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. It does take time. And I think this is when in times of crisis is both an opportunity, but also a challenge, because you need to be patient. You need to go through this process and be able and willing to invest this necessary time. And then the magic happens, I would say.
And I would just kind of reframe what Ed said before in a way, but maybe contradicting to what you want to hear. I think we have to stop talking about leadership, because if you talk about leadership, you automatically think there's somebody responsible, there's somebody else who's going to do it, somebody's going to lead me and show me what to do. No, we are in such a big mess. Like, we all have to be. So it is about followership. It's about responsible followership and doing it your freaking self. Sorry. It's not about assigning to somebody else or the government or the business or the manager and so on. And actually, I stopped talking about leadership, but I don't talk about followership either. We started using that very strange and ugly term "leading," so following in the front and leading in the back, to describe something that's somewhere in the middle, because neither one will get us the results that we're looking for.
Yeah, that's another overcoming the trade-off. Leadership and following is basically one. Yeah, so it's about self-leadership, but also to follow at the same time. Ed, what is your remark? Should we just get rid of the term leadership there, or should we reframe it? What's the new narrative? You are talking about the new narrative of business. Is there also a new narrative on leadership?
I think there's a new narrative about it's not a new narrative, but we have to understand that business is a deeply human activity, and that, you know, I think we're part of the great apes. We're hierarchical. We always will be, but we can overcome that in time. So if we have a principle we talk about a lot with our students that says, if you think something's wrong with something, then critique it by creating something better. Right? If rather than critique what's there all the time, and you see a lot of people on the left and the right doing that, go out and create something that's better, that works better, and that's what you can do in a relatively free society. Is that leadership? Well, I don't know. I'm a little bit like my friend Jim Collins. I'm a little bit of a leadership skeptic. You know, I think oftentimes, well, why did their crops fail in the olden days? Why did the crops fail? God did it. Why did my child get sick? God did it, etc. As the Renaissance happened, etc., we got more scientific explanations. I think management theory is a little bit in the why did this company succeed? Leadership. Why did this company fail? Leadership. Why did this happen? And I think Christof's right. We need a much more nuanced idea of what's a human being inside these business organizations. And it may turn out that leadership is one of those kind of rough ideas that we can kind of do without if we have a more nuanced way to think about that.
We have 3 more minutes, so I make some 2-3 last questions, very short. One thing which is interesting so far is also if you think leadership in a new way, more systemic, more following, leading at the same time, does this have any effect on remuneration, on salaries? Because we have, of course, this strong hierarchy in the companies with different salary levels, so to say. But if everyone is responsible, is there also some kind of change in incentives necessary? What is your opinion, Christof? Because you were touching it a little bit. And then I have a question for all three, the last question for everyone. But with this kind of remuneration, did you do some research on this? How this is changing also the mindset?
So I specifically did not do any research on remuneration, but I think when we hear those bonus payments, where there's currently now lots of discussions going on, I think that speaks for itself, that we're talking about dimensions that might not be necessarily appropriate in a lot of what's going on. Practically, and this is also what I'm seeing when we look at the leadership lab and people, how they develop. Money in itself doesn't make people happy when they're in their 40s and 50s and wake up one day and say, all right, so what am I doing here? And I believe this component has been missing, and also how companies create jobs, how they create employment, conveying this purpose to people. And I mean, you might be as cheesy as saying make workplaces happy places, but I think this is really what's needed. Focusing on that aspect more. So not thinking about how bonus payments need to be changed, but on the other hand, how we can induce this purpose into our everyday work and make work sensible.
Perfect. Purpose is what makes you happy. We are now already at the end. Yeah, time was flying. I have one question for everyone, maybe just one sentence. So, because 2 years ago we had similar discussions, I have the feeling over the last 2 years a lot happened, especially intellectually, and the new mindset we are now talking of makes really sense to me, at least. If we now meet in 5 years again, how can we feel that really something has changed? Not in talk, but how did the world change in 5 years? What will be different that we see now we live in a different world with less trade-off thinking and more purpose? Just maybe one sentence. If you come to Frankfurt in 5 years or anywhere, how do you see things have changed? Just one sentence, everyone.
I'd say,
go ahead.
I'd say if all of this happens, we will not have this discussion because there's no need anymore to discuss these issues. We could focus our attention on other important aspects.
Very good. Oliver, how do you see it? Did the automotive energy system change?
The point is exactly this, that we won't see it. Because it will be so integrated in everything that we're doing that we don't notice it anymore. That would be the situation where you say it has become real because it's taken for granted. It's not something that sticks out anymore. It is just there.
The new reality. Ed, your last remark. So if you come to Europe again, hopefully soon, how do you feel that we achieved that your book is not necessary anymore?
Nobody asked me a question about Milton Friedman.
Okay, I won't. Okay, thank you so much. It was great discussion. I think we set the framework for the rest of the conference, and many good speakers will follow. And I think they can also reference to this, what we were talking. As in the beginning, it's always important to really make the playing field. I think this was done very well, and it was a great honor for me to have all three of you in the same monitor, and hope to see you personally soon. And thank you again. It was a great pleasure for me. And yeah, stay integrated to the conference, participate, network, and yeah, have a good day and a good night. Maybe you have a couple of hours of sleep at.
Thanks, Renee.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.